Well, Lord Jesus, we are once again gathered here to learn from you and learn from your word, Lord. And we are first and foremost, as we just celebrated with Ian, we're thankful for Ian. And I'm thankful for each and every one of the people in this room and the things that you are doing in our lives through your word and through your love. So may we understand that more and more each and every day. In your name, amen. Amen. Okay, so last time we saw, don't do that, okay? So last time we saw Nebuchadnezzar go through a fairly difficult time, but come out on the other end with a correct view of God. So I thought it'd be good to kind of back up, read that, because it's going to set some of the context for some of our study tonight in Daniel chapter 5. Okay, so I'm going to go back to Daniel chapter 4, verse 34, and just read. And just keep in mind that this is, again, at least from a biblical standpoint, these are the last words that we'll hear from Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, we're not going to hear from him any longer. All right, so this is what he has to say at the end of that time of his humbling. By the end of that period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, but he does according to his will in the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And no one can ward off his hand or say to him, "What hast thou done?" At that time my reason returned to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me for the glory of my kingdom, and my counselors and my nobles began seeking me out. So I was reestablished, and my sovereignty and surpassing greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are true, and his ways are righteous, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. All right, so that is Nebuchadnezzar, the last things that he says. And if you look back all the way to the beginning of our study in Daniel, this is quite a stride for Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had, of course, the dream that Daniel gave to him about the statue and the golden head, the silver arm, or the silver chest and arms, and the abdomen and thighs of bronze, and the legs of iron and the feet of iron and clay. And those represented these different kingdoms, his kingdom being the kingdom of gold, but that would be replaced by this next kingdom, and then that kingdom would be replaced, and that kingdom would be replaced. And you see somewhat of a struggle on Nebuchadnezzar's part in terms of accepting that, in many senses almost rebelling against that, to the point that he was willing to and ready to slaughter Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. In fact, he attempted to, with exclaiming, "What God can stand against me and prevent me from doing this?" So so for him to then come to this place where he not only recognizes that the God of the Israelites was good, that all his ways were true, that all his ways were righteous, but to also recognize that he is in charge and that he does what he wills, and he is the one that sets up kings and tears down kings. That was a major step for Nebuchadnezzar, and that's, we don't have anything, at least from a biblical historical perspective, what his kingdom was like after that and what his reign was like after that. Okay, but that's what we hear. That's the last word from Nebuchadnezzar. So we're moving now into chapter 5, and chapter 5 chronologically is a little bit out of order. So to give you some sense, the events in chapter 7 and 8 that we'll read about probably take place 10 to 15 years prior to chapter 5. Hard to say exactly what that would be, the number of years, but this is not written in chronological order. Okay, by this point in time, Nebuchadnezzar has passed off the scene. So I wanted to give you some sense of historical context from a Babylonian standpoint in the Babylonian kingdom. I mentioned Nabopolassar. Nabopolassar was Nebuchadnezzar's dad. He reigned from 627 BC to 605 BC, at which point he passed away. Nebuchadnezzar then took over and brought the Babylonian kingdom to new heights. In fact, it reached its greatest heights and greatest expanse under Nebuchadnezzar. He reigned for 43 years, so he reigned from 605 BC to 562 BC, at which point in time he died. After that, it's kind of a mess. From essentially 562 to 539 BC, we see this. We see Babylon in its really what would be the term? I keep wanting decline. I kept on wanting to say downgrade, and that was not what I was trying to say. But decline is the word I was looking for. So let me just give you from what we can piece together in terms of biblical records and other extra biblical historical records, what the line of kings would look like after Nebuchadnezzar, and we're going to go through a couple of names here. Okay, immediately after Nebuchadnezzar would be the king Evil Merodach, and he reigned only for 2 years, from 562 to 560. I believe that there is a biblical mention of him. He then was overthrown by a coup by Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law, Neriglissar. Fun to say and spell. He reigned then, and that coup was successful. He reigned from 560 to 556. He had a son, Labashi Marduk, who only reigned for 2 months. I'm not sure exactly what happened to Neriglissar. It sounds like he passed off the scene. He died. I don't know if he died of natural causes. I think that but he died. Okay. Nonetheless, yes, Ian.
He reigned from 560 to 556.
556. That's right. So BC.
560 to 556.
Yeah, BC they counted down.
So he's 6 years old.
That's dumb.
Going backwards.
It's not. It's all dates point to the birth of Christ. Okay, so 560 is pointing towards it, and then the birth of Christ heads after that. Okay, it sets the time clock again, and then after that. I guess I said points to it. It's not exactly
how did
right.
they track that? Like, is like their set number of dates? Like, no. Like God was like, okay, so it's gonna start at 1,000, and it's gonna end here. This is when my son was born. And then 33 years
These
later,
are dates of
born.
men, so it wasn't God that decided
And I think
that.
what he's confused about is the fact that Nebuchadnezzar did not sit there and say it's 586 BC, because they didn't know the years.
Right. So then that was. Can you put your hand down? I see it. That was. It was. I don't know who decided. Okay, we're going to start counting from this point forward. I don't know who did that, but there's more modern historians. So that would be something that you could look up.
So write it out, right?
Let's go ahead and talk about it afterwards. We
Yeah.
can talk about it afterwards. Okay? Yes, Simon.
I'm reading my Bible every night when I go to bed.
Uh-huh.
And I'm in Genesis, and I noticed there's a lot of old people, and they live like for 900 years and 600 years. Why is that so? We live for like 98 years now.
Let's go ahead and talk about that afterwards as well, because it's way off topic. It's a great question, but let's talk about it afterwards. Okay, bud? Good questions. So anyway, so Neriglissar, he had this son. I'm not sure again what happened to him, but he had this son, Labisha Marduk, who only reigned for 2 months. Okay, and this is going to bring us into our study tonight. He was overthrown by a man named Nabonidus, who reigned from 556 to 539. Okay, and that is going to be essentially part of the kingship that we're going to read about in chapter 5. Now, Nabonidus married a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. So Nabonidus is Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law. And Nebuchadnezzar's daughter gave birth to Belshazzar. Right? Belshazzar then would be the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Right? Now, it's important for you to understand this about the Arabic language at this point in time. There was not a word in the Arabic language, or not Arabic, Aramaic language for grandfather. And that word didn't exist. Okay, so we're going to look at, in Daniel chapter 5, Belshazzar, and he's going to be described as essentially, Nebuchadnezzar is going to be described as his father. Okay, but history would tell us that he was his grandfather. Okay, now Nabonidus, Belshazzar's dad, okay, he was a king that really was in many cases absent from the capital city of Babylon, which was actually Babylon. And he went on conquest, or actually, and especially at the latter end of his reign, went out into open field battle against the Persians and the Medes. Okay, not really a conquest at that point, but more of a defense, because the Persians were on the advance at that point in time. There was some fairly significant and decisive battles that Nabonidus lost, and then he essentially, to put it lightly, okay, or I guess to put it undelicately, tucked tail and ran, okay, and never really came back to Babylon. He had left, during these conquests and during these defenses, he had left his son Belshazzar as co-regent, or co-king, if you will, in Babylon, okay? And so you're going to see here Belshazzar being described as king, right? Despite the fact that Nabonidus was king, Belshazzar was also recognized as king, okay, during this time. All right, so then Nabonidus lost these decisive battles, and Cyrus then, the king of the Medes and the Persians, is on the march and is going to come lay siege to Babylon, okay? And that's our context. Now, this is a side note, but I think it's a fairly important side note. There are many scholars and critics that years ago have looked at Daniel chapter 5 with a great deal of skepticism, because they could not find in the historical records that they had available to them that Belshazzar was ever considered king, that it was his dad, Nabonidus, that was considered king. All right? In fact, one of the key ancient historians that they would rely on for their information about this time was Herodotus. I mean, he was an ancient historian that told much about the Babylonian kingdom. And so they have looked at Daniel chapter 5 as being historically inaccurate because Belshazzar is described as king. However, recent discoveries, and I don't know how recent they are, recent in archaeology is like the last 50 years. Recent discoveries have demonstrated that Daniel is actually exactly right on. And there was something called the Babylonian Chronicle that was discovered that confirmed that Belshazzar was indeed co-regent with his dad Nabonidus, which is strong evidence for Daniel being written in the 6th century, when what we consider conservative scholars would suggest that he wrote it, because he had intimate details about the politics of Babylon during the time of when they were in their demise or their decline. Okay, so side note, but important. Now, the Babylonian Chronicle, to give you an idea in terms of the amount of information that can be given about the chapter that we're reading, and the historical events surrounding it, gives us such detail that we can date the event of this night to the day, October 12th, 539 BC. Okay, so now the Babylonian Chronicle doesn't describe anything that's happening inside the palace, but it describes things happening outside of the palace. Okay, so meaning the siege and that's happening. Hey, come on in, we got a chair right here. How are you? Good. Yes, cupcakes. Yeah. Do we have a plate? You can pick whichever one you want. So anyway, very specific amount of detail in the historical records. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit about what happened to Babylon. We're in Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5. Okay? And we're really just getting started. Okay? So that's the events that are surrounding Daniel chapter 5. So let's go ahead and start off here. Let me make sure that I didn't forget anything. No, I don't think I forgot anything. Okay, so let's go ahead and start off here. Daniel chapter 5, and we'll read the first 4 verses. So Belshazzar, the king, held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, in order that the kings and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Okay, so that's what's going on inside the palace. Now understand that Babylon's kingdom is severely weakened at this point in time. It's ready for collapse. However, there were many of the opinion, in particular inside the city of Babylon, that thought that this city is impregnable. Okay, and they had good reason to think that. It had a river that was running through it. The Euphrates River was running through it, so that any siege that would happen, when in ancient times they would lay siege to these cities that were all surrounded by walls, and they would essentially cut off all supplies of the city. So eventually the people in it would starve, and they would either open their gates or something to that effect. Well, Babylon had a river of fresh water running through it, the Euphrates River. Its walls were anywhere between 50 to 100 feet tall, and were anywhere between 18 to 30 feet wide. So it is an impressive fortress. The amount of square footage, square mileage really inside the city would allow them to grow their own crops, enough to sustain the population within. So for all intents and purposes, it was a city that you had to breach to overthrow it, and it was extremely difficult to breach because of the defenses. Right? So Belshazzar is within these walls, despite the fact that Cyrus has overthrown much of the kingdom, feeling rather comfortable, okay, within his own kingdom. Now, understand that Belshazzar was more than likely a teenager when he saw Nebuchadnezzar die, okay, when Nebuchadnezzar, his grandfather, passed away, right? I don't think it's a reach, especially considering what we're going to be reading here, to think that Nebuchadnezzar taught Belshazzar many things, that Belshazzar would have been informed of the dream that he had had. Interestingly, about the gold head and the kingdoms that would come after that, the chest of silver and the arms of silver, right? Interestingly, here we're seeing that transition. That's where we are historically, the fulfillment of that portion of that dream. Right, but Belshazzar more than likely would have been taught those things, possibly by Nebuchadnezzar himself. Furthermore, I don't think it's a reach to think that Nebuchadnezzar taught his children and his grandchildren about the humbling experience that he went through, that we went through last week, Daniel chapter 4. Okay, before he died. Right, so he would have had access to those instructions. Now, apparently he spurned those instructions. He is under the impression, this is what his behavior is telling us, and we're going to read about this and what Daniel's reaction is to this. He's under the impression that, much like Nebuchadnezzar was under the impression, that the fact that he had obtained and retained articles from these various temples of countries that they had overtaken as Babylonians, that was an indication that their gods were more powerful than the surrounding countries' gods, and that the king then, by proxy, was more powerful than those as well. All right, so by taking these vessels out and using them for their own purposes and own worship of their own gods, was an affront to the people of that God and also that God. Right? And it was essentially saying, we're better, we're stronger than you. Okay, that's his actions. That's what his actions are saying. Very similar to Nebuchadnezzar as a young man. Okay, so that's what's going on here. Now, I think it's important. Let me go ahead and kind of set the stage here. All right. In terms of, because it says in verse 4 that they drank wine and they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, of iron, of wood, and stone. So I would like to read Romans 1 for us, because I think Paul really does a good job describing the mindset of a man like Belshazzar. He's not describing Belshazzar here, but he's describing the mindset of Belshazzar. So Romans 1, turn to Romans 1, verse 18. And we'll look at what Paul has to say about this. Romans 1, verse 18. Okay? And we're going to read several verses. All right, so for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculation, and their foolish hearts was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and of four-footed animals and crawling creatures. Right? So Paul describes here the mindset of an idolater, right? That God himself, God, the creator of the world, that Nebuchadnezzar came to understand who he was in our last chapter, that God has made himself clearly known to all mankind through his creation, that any man, anywhere, anytime, can look at creation and say, okay, this God does indeed exist. There is a God, and there is a God that brought all of this into existence. And I can seek that God, right? That's what Paul is saying, right? And someone that rejects that truth is suppressing the truth, in Paul's terms, suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. And his mind has become foolish, despite the fact that he has been professing to be wise, and his heart has he says in verse 21, for even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or gave thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish hearts were darkened, okay, or are darkened. That's describing Belshazzar, right? That's the state that Belshazzar is in right now. He's worshiping gold, silver, bronze, right? These metals, right? All the way down to wood, stone and wood. Okay, so anyway, that's he's suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. Okay, the truth that not only he knew from creation, but also that I am of the opinion, and because of what we'll read later on, that not Daniel but Nebuchadnezzar taught him. Okay, all right. So verse 5. So that's the context of who we're looking at here. Okay, so verse 5. Suddenly. This is kind of an interesting scene. Suddenly, the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. Okay, so I think So there's some scholarly debate about exactly what that means, okay? But right. So you can imagine the scene. There's this party going on. There's a significant party going on. They're drunk at this point in time. They're partaking in who knows what, and all of a sudden on the wall, obviously quite conspicuously, there's this hand that appears. Rather, I'm sure. In a who knows what it looked like, but it was enough for the knees. It says the knees of the king to start knocking together and his hip joints to go slack, meaning that he probably had an accident. Okay. Let's just put it delicately, okay? So he becomes scared. We could put it more bluntly, he had this stuff scared out of him, okay? Okay, I could be even more blunt, but I'll leave that word for another time. Okay, so anyway, so that's what's going on now, okay? So this would be quite a sobering experience, okay? And so the rest of the chapter is going to be based off of this. So the king called aloud. All right, so he's going to roll in the same guys that Nebuchadnezzar rolled in several times and was never successful, but he's going to roll those guys in. The king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me will be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. Now, interestingly, third ruler in the kingdom. Nabonidus, his dad, him, and then this other person, right? So third rule, that description is one of the key evidences that Daniel knew exactly that there was another king, okay? And that he was right involved in the history of this, okay? Right, so then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his face grew even paler, and his nobles were perplexed. All right, so once again, we see these quote-unquote wise men come in and are unable to help, in this case, Belshazzar, right? They were unable to help Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2 of Daniel, and were unable to help Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4 of Daniel as well. Daniel, in both cases, came to the rescue of those quote-unquote wise men. It reminds me of, and you don't have to flip there, but it reminds me of Paul. He says this about the wisdom of the world, because that's what these men really have. They're not connected to divine wisdom, but they're called wise men, but they're wise men only entitled by men. So in 1 Corinthians 1, actually, Paul says this, for it is written, I will destroy, this is God speaking, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the clever I will set aside. Where is the wise man? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? Right? And that's essentially a description of these men. Okay? Now, let's keep going here. The queen, so probably his mother, okay, probably Belshazzar's mother, entered the banquet hall. So she is not part of this party. But she enters the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles. So this is obviously making quite the stir in the palace at this point in time. Okay, the queen enters, and the queen spoke and said, O king, bless you. O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magician, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. So again, grandfather, right? There's the lack of the Aramaic word for grandfather there. Grandfather would be based off of what we can put together historically. This would be grandfather. Right? This was because of an extraordinary spirit, knowledge, and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. So Daniel is famous, right? We've talked about that. Belshazzar, I think, knows who Daniel is, because he's going to go on when he has his interaction with Daniel in the next couple of verses. He's going to say things that the queen didn't say about Daniel. So he's going to give even more information, betraying the fact that he knew who Daniel was. Daniel, at this point in time, apparently has been put out to pasture, for lack of a better term. Who knows who did it? It wasn't Nebuchadnezzar, right? But we are now 23 years from Nebuchadnezzar's death. So Daniel's influence on the administration of Babylon has lessened at this point in time. Okay, he was not called in right away. Okay, so, but he is now being called in. Okay, and he's got some fairly harsh words for Belshazzar. So let's go ahead and keep looking at this. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah?" So he recognizes this exile. The queen didn't say that. It's possible that someone else told him, but it's also possible that he knew who Daniel was. Okay. All right, verse 14. "Now I have heard about you, that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom has been found in you." So this is something very similar to what Nebuchadnezzar had said about Daniel, something that the queen says about Daniel, something that most people that know of Daniel say about him. Right? "Just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me, that they might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me. But they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now if you are able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom." Right? So he is now introduced with Daniel. He gives Daniel the same promise that he gave these other guys and says, "I'm going to make you third ruler. It's just going to be this great position. Everything's going to be okay. I just need to know what this means. It scared me." Okay? Let's put it that way. Okay? So, right? Now, and understand, remember, right, the historical context. Cyrus the Persian, right, and the Persian army is essentially at the doorstep. Okay? So, and yet they're having this large party. Right? So verse 17, "Then Daniel answered and said before the king." Now, the way this reads, you get the sense that Daniel doesn't have a lot of respect for Belshazzar. He doesn't address Belshazzar in the same way that he addressed Nebuchadnezzar. And the affection that he had for Nebuchadnezzar is not at least felt in the way this whole thing goes down. I may be wrong, but I don't think I am in this, okay? And you'll see what I mean by this. He says this, he says, "Keep your gifts for yourself." So he doesn't say live forever, "O king, live forever," which was the common greeting, right? He just says, "Keep your gifts for yourself, or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him." Okay? In other words, I have no interest in being part of your administration, no interest in being part of what you're offering. Okay? 18, verse 18, "O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. And because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples, nations, and the men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished he killed, and whomever he wished he spared alive. And whomever he wished he elevated, and whomever he wished he humbled." Now understand what Daniel just said to him. He said that, this is Nebuchadnezzar. God instilled in him these things. Okay? And which was the revelation that Nebuchadnezzar had a very difficult time coming to, but eventually came to. And that's what we started this whole thing off. Right, verse 20, "But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was disposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes." And so that was the key point. That's what we spent time talking about. One of the, if not the central theme of Daniel is that God himself, okay, through his will installs kings at his pleasure for his doing, okay, and that he's in charge. Right? That was something that Nebuchadnezzar came to recognize, and that's what Daniel says, until he recognized that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. Verse 22, very important. "Yet you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this." Right? So Daniel points to the fact that you knew this. Daniel more than likely knew Belshazzar at his birth. Okay? More than likely got to see Belshazzar grow up. Like I said, Belshazzar probably would have been a teenager, the death of his grandpa. Okay, given the position that he's at 539 BC, he was, right, at least in his teens by the time Nebuchadnezzar died. So Daniel probably saw the instruction that Nebuchadnezzar had given Belshazzar, one of his grandchildren, okay, and he holds him to it. He says, you knew all this. You knew the story. You knew what Nebuchadnezzar had gone through. You knew the result of that humbling, and yet here you are. Okay? Right, so that's a very important aspect of this. Verse 23, but you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. Okay, so that's what I was saying. By taking these vessels, by doing what he did, he set himself in opposition to God. Okay, so that's what Daniel says. But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. And they have brought the vessels of his house before you. And you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines have been drinking wine for them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, hear, or understand. But the God in whose hands are your life breath and your ways, you have not glorified. Then the hand was sent from him, and this inscription was written out. Okay, so Daniel has, like I'm saying, he doesn't have a lot of respect for this man. Okay, I think that Daniel not only lacks a good, healthy respect for this individual, Belshazzar, but I think that he's also, in many ways, offended by the fact that he has done this with the vessels of the God he loves. Right? Okay, I can see that as being not a far reach for Daniel. Okay, Daniel, by the way, at this point in time is in his 80s probably. 70s or his 80s, right? So he was a teenager. Well, he's probably more along it. Well, no, yeah, probably in his 70s, 70 to 80s. Okay, he would have been in his 60s when Nebuchadnezzar died. Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar reigned for 43 years, and Daniel was a teenager when he was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar. So at the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Right, so he's an older man at this point in time. Now, before we go on, I think it's really important here to take a little bit of pause because we have this description of idol worship, and I do want to mention this, especially in the light of the context of what I read in Romans 1. Okay, you know, the fact that Paul recognizes that this is a men suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. Okay, and so what I want to do is just look at Isaiah's perspective on this. So turn to Isaiah 44, and Isaiah is going to describe some of what might be considered the insanity of idol worship. Okay, and maybe not necessarily the insanity, but from a very real standpoint, the logical contradictions that are found within it. Okay, Isaiah 44, verse 12. We'll read about 6 verses here. Okay, so this is Isaiah speaking. Okay, and there's this fairly large section of Isaiah where God challenges the Israelites in regards to their idols and the idols that they're worshiping. Okay, you gonna take off? Go for it, man. We'll see you. Okay. So
Where's he going?
he's got to go do stuff. So okay.
How about if there's no study next week? Just so you know.
Yeah, no study next week. Okay. Okay.
Probably shut up.
Thank you, Becky. See you Wednesday. Okay, so here's what he says. So this is Isaiah, okay, challenging essentially the Israelites who are worshiping not the God of Israel. Okay, they're worshiping idols. All right, so the man shapes iron into a cutting tool and does his work over the coals, fashioning it with hammers and working it with his strong arm. He also gets hungry and his strength fails. He drinks no water and becomes weary. Another shapes wood. He extends a measuring line. He outlines it with red chalk. He works it with planes and outlines it with a compass and makes it like the form of a man, like the beauty of a man, so that it may sit in his house. Surely he cuts cedars for himself, and he takes a cypress or an oak and raises it for himself among the trees or the forest. He plants a fir, and the rain makes it grow. then it becomes something for a man to burn. Okay? So he takes one of them, okay, so he cuts down this tree, and he takes a log, and he takes one of them to warm himself. He also makes a fire to bake bread. He also makes a god and worships it. He makes it a graven image and falls down before it. So with the same tree, the man takes part of the tree, burns it to cook his meal, keep him warm, and the other part of the tree he makes an idol. Okay, he goes on to say this, half of it he burns in the fire. Over this half he eats meat as he roasts a roast and is satisfied. He also warms himself and says, aha, I am warm, I have seen the fire. But the rest of it he makes into a god, his graven image. He falls down before it and worships. He also prays and to it says, deliver me, for thou art my God. Right? So that's what I mean. So Isaiah is describing the logical contradiction in that. With this wood, you warm yourself, you burn it, you as the man have essentially rule over it. And then the other half, you subject yourself to it as if it rules over you. That doesn't make a lot of sense, right? And that's what Isaiah is trying to do here. All right, same thing that's being described here of Belshazzar is doing the exact same thing, okay? Because these are things that mankind, gold, silver, bronze, right, iron, stone, wood, they have the capacity to shape, they have the capacity to form things out of it. So in reality, we are sovereign over those materials, and yet they make them sovereign over them. You know, at least that's the idea. So what then is the attraction of this? Okay, and I think that this speaks to even our heart. Okay, the attraction of this, I believe, is that it's deep within a man's evil nature to want to be autonomous. And by that I mean we want to say what's right for us, and we want to say what's wrong for us. Meaning that we want to make our own moral decisions, okay? And we want to not be held accountable to anyone really higher than our own selves, okay? When you start to do a study of gods that extend beyond Christianity, in particular in Judaism, you will find that majority of gods are small enough to not hold accountable those who worship them. Okay, the Greek mythology would probably be the best example, right? These were gods that had as many, if not more, problems than the humans that served them. Okay, they couldn't hold them accountable in their moral behavior, and because of that, then that allowed the man to be autonomous. Okay, atheism is certainly an example of that. Okay, you know, I mean, atheism is just a modern idolatry. I worship myself. I don't have to hold myself accountable to anything other than what I think is right and wrong, okay? And maybe some social contract, okay, that has some power over me, okay? So that is, I think, what we see here is deep within the heart of man. In fact, I think that, you know, when you look into the story of Genesis, in particular Genesis chapter 3, God puts this tree in the middle of the garden and says, don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And yet if you ponder, why does it say knowledge of good and evil? What is it about the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Okay, and I think I've said this in this study before. I'll say it again. That I think is God describing that when you take of that tree, you're deciding for yourself what's good. You're deciding for yourself what's bad. Okay, and you're becoming like God to yourself. Okay. And that is exactly what Belshazzar has done, despite the fact that Nebuchadnezzar had told him quite the contrary. Okay. All right, so that's where we're at, okay, with Belshazzar, okay? The fool truly says in his heart there is no God, okay? And men love darkness. That's Jesus' description of this whole thing. Men love darkness, they're committed to it. And that's Belshazzar, okay? To a T. Now, let's get to this thing that was written, the thing that caused Belshazzar's knees to knock and for him to have an accident, okay? All right, so now this is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel upharsin. And we all say, of course. Okay, now undoubtedly, Daniel gives us what would be considered the decoded message, okay? the words that he uses are Aramaic words, and so if they were written just like this, it would have been no mystery what was at least written. Okay, so there's been, it's just, if you read 100 commentaries on this, there will be 100 different opinions on what the message looked like, before Daniel decoded it. Okay, whatever it looked like, we don't know because it is not told to us. We can say that it took supernatural insight to get at its interpretation. Okay, so he states these words. Now, let's read verse 26. This interpretation of the message, mene. Now, mene comes from another root word. So this is so to use some technical language here, this is a cognate of a Hebrew root word, mina. Okay, cognate means that both of these words were derived from the same root word. Okay, so mina means, I had to write it down, means to count. Okay, that's what the Hebrew, this root word means, to count. So mene, and then here's Daniel's interpretation. God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. So he's counted it, to count. He's numbered it. Now he says that twice. In other words, mene, mene. Counted it, it's coming to an end. Okay. Tekel, okay, comes from the same root word as shekel. Shekel was in the Hebrew to weigh. Okay. So tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and been found deficient. 28, verse 28, Peres, or it says Upharsin. I'm not sure why they're different in 25 and 28. I forgot to look at that. But this comes from the Hebrew word half, meaning half a shekel or divided. Okay, and so he says your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. Right. So he delivers this, slams it down, and this might be some of the reasons he says I have no desire for your gifts. Because your kingdom is falling. Please don't put me in the garb, because the Medes and the Persians are coming, and they're coming now. Okay, and I don't want to be associated with you whatsoever. So that's what Belshazzar hears from Daniel. Now, this is what Belshazzar does in response. Then Belshazzar, verse 29, gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck, and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. So that same night, October 12th, 539 BC. Okay? We'll talk about Darius next week. Not next week, the next time we meet. But I find it ironic that the last proclamation of a Babylonian king was to install as the third most powerful individual in their kingdom a Hebrew, a nation that they had overthrown 70 years prior to this. A nation that God had courted for so many years and then used Babylon as the instrument to overthrow them, and now a Jew is sitting at the top of that kingdom at the end of it all. Okay. All right. Now, before we leave here, I think there's some really interesting things that we have to talk about in terms of this overthrow of the Babylonians. Okay. We're at the end of the chapter. We won't go any further in this. But let's go ahead and churn to Isaiah 44 again. Okay. What's that? I need to close my Bible? Yeah, that's right. Yep. Okay, so Isaiah 44. And I'm going to start reading in... I'll start reading in verse 24. Okay. Isaiah, let me give you a little bit of history with Isaiah. Isaiah's prophecy, if we take seriously the proclamations of Isaiah in the book, took place in the mid to late 8th century BC, 750s to 700 BC. This is a good 150 to 200 years before the events that we just read. Okay. At this point in time, I think very safe to say that Daniel had not been born. It's very safe to say that certainly Cyrus, the Persian king, had not been born. Darius, this individual that was mentioned, had not been born. Belshazzar had not been born. Nebuchadnezzar likely hadn't been born. Okay? But what we're going to read is pretty remarkable considering that date. And something that critical scholars are going to say, no way that Isaiah wrote this in the time span that he said he wrote it, because a man can't write these things this far in advance. So here's what we'll read, okay? What's that? They've got that part right, that no man could have written this. Okay, so Isaiah 44 is, again, we just read from this, okay, but this is a challenge from God to the Israelites regarding their idolatry. Right? So verse 24, thus says the Lord, your Redeemer, and the one who formed you from the womb. I, the Lord, am the maker of all things, stretching out the heavens by myself, and spreading out the earth all alone, causing the omens of boasters to fail, making fools of diviners, causing wise men to draw back, and turning their knowledge into foolishness. Think about the courts that Belshazzar, the people that Belshazzar brought in, okay? Verse 26, confirming the word of his servant and performing the purpose of his messenger. It is I, so this is God speaking, it is I who says of Jerusalem, she shall be inhabited, and of the cities of Judah they shall be built, and I will raise her ruins again, raise up her ruins again. Now understand, Jerusalem, right, at this point in time was still staying in Isaiah's day. Isaiah had proclaimed, Jeremiah had proclaimed, or will proclaim, that Jerusalem would be leveled, flattened, brought to ruins, okay? But they also spoke of hope, that there would be a restoration of the Israelites to their land after Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah puts a time scale of 70 years on that, okay? It is under the Persians, in particular Cyrus, that will occur, okay? That Cyrus the king will make a proclamation and say, these Jews can return to their homeland and build their Jerusalem, okay? So, but God is saying here, it is I who says of Jerusalem, she shall be inhabited, and of the cities of Judah, they shall be built, and I will raise up her ruins again, right? So this is a prophecy that this would come back. Verse 27, it is I who says to the depths of the sea, be dried up, and I will make your rivers dry. We're going to look at that here in just a second. Verse 28, it is I who says of Cyrus, specifically named Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he will perform all my desire. And he declares of Jerusalem, she will be built, and of the temples, your foundation will be laid. In other words, he's saying Cyrus is going to do this, okay? Verse 1 of chapter 45, thus says the Lord to Cyrus, his anointed, whom I have taken by the right hand to subdue nations before him, and to loose the loins of kings. Right? So, the knees knocking and hip joints becoming slack, loosing the loins of kings. That's prophesied, that someone will mess themselves. Okay, so to open doors before him so that the gates will not be shut. Now, that term, and we're going to stop right there, but it says to open the doors before him so that the gates will not be shut. And then back in verse 27, and I will make your rivers dry. So let's read here. This is extra biblical history, okay? This was, the passage that I'm going to read you was written by Herodotus, which was that ancient historian I was telling you about. And he describes in detail how the ancient city of Babylon was taken over. Okay, how these Persians were able to penetrate the city that, for all intents and purposes, looked like it can never be penetrated. And he's going to describe this, okay? And this is, if you're really wondering, it's, I don't know, kind of like we have Isaiah 45 verse, whatever Herodotus has, chapter and verses. It's 1:191, if you want to look this up. You can read this for yourself. Right now, it says this, whether someone, so this is Herodotus talking, whether someone advised him being Cyrus, in his difficulty, or whether he perceived for himself what to do, I do not know. But he did the following, so he's going to describe what Cyrus did. He posted his army at the place where the river goes into the city, the Euphrates, and a part of it behind the city, where the river comes out. So Cyrus set up his army at essentially where the river goes into the city and comes out. Okay? And here's what he told that army. He said, and told his men to enter the city by the channel of the Euphrates when they saw it be fordable. Having disposed them and given this command, he himself marched away with those of his army who could not fight. And when he came to the lake, Cyrus dealt with it and with the river just as had the Babylonian queen. So that's history that we don't need to get into. But he did this. Drawing off the river by a canal into the lake, which was a marsh, he made the stream sink until its former channels could be forded. When this happened, the Persians who were posted with this objective made their way into Babylon by the channel of the Euphrates. So in other words, what's being described is this, that Cyrus marched away and he went upstream of the Euphrates, and there was this old canal system that had been built by this previous queen that he reopened. And he directed the water out of the Euphrates River into a marshland. Okay? And of course, the river then just started to go like this. The raging river started to drop in terms of level. And he's got this army just waiting there until, and of course they're privy to what he's going to do, waiting until they can go under the city's walls where the river enters. Okay? Right, so, and that's how it was taken. Now, here's what he goes on to say. When this happened, the Persians who were posted, okay, I've already read that. Now, if the Babylonians had known beforehand or learned what Cyrus was up to, they would have let the Persians enter the city and have destroyed them utterly. For then they would have shut all the gates that opened on the river and mounted the walls that ran along the river banks, and so caught their enemies in a trap. In other words, if they had known this, they would have never they would have devised a trap, essentially a kill box for them to all come in and kill them all in one place. Okay, but they didn't. But as it was, the Persians took them unawares, and because of the great size of the city, those who dwell there say, those in the outer parts of it were overcome, but the inhabitants of the middle part knew nothing of it. All this time they were dancing and celebrating a holiday which happened to fall then, until they learned the truth only too well. That describes the night that we just read about, okay, outside of the city. What we read is inside of the city, what's happening in this holiday, quote unquote, this holiday that Belshazzar is celebrating. There is other records of this, and Herodotus, gives an inkling of this, that there were people that in Babylon that the next day had no idea that the Babylonian Empire had been overthrown. It was taken in such swift detail that Belshazzar had been slain without many in the cities not even knowing it. So, okay, right. So that's Daniel chapter 5. Okay, interesting, lots of history there, but I think very interesting. We got more history to go through with Daniel chapter 6 with Darius. We got some interesting things to talk about with him too. So, okay, all right, we're done. So, no, we have to pray, though, first. Pray. Don't leave. You're so good. You're so good. Okay, let me pray, and then we'll go about our ways. Well, Jesus, we are grateful once again for your word. I'm grateful for this chapter in Daniel and the things that we can learn from it, and the things that we can learn, quite honestly, from foolish men. Men who rejected you, men who would not bend their knee to you. And Lord, we just ask that our hearts and our minds would be that we would be humble before you, that we would recognize your lordship and your kingship in our life, but we would also recognize your great love for us, and that you are, just as Nebuchadnezzar professed, you are good, and that your ways are right and your ways are good, and that we would trust you and we would have faith in you in that way. In your name, amen. Okay. Get out of here, Isaiah, or Simon. Okay. I don't think we'll talk for 2 hours. Were you going to say something, Becky?
So who's Darius in